Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. My name is David,
My name's Matt.
and we are the Taylor Bros. And today we're talking about those most famous of emotions, anger. And you talked about, Matt, making anger count.
Today we're going to be getting a bit hot under the collar and raging against the machine.
Is that what it is?
I think so. Yeah, anger. I think it gets a bad rap generally. It's really interesting. A lot of stuff generally out there, the way we talk about it, and even just reading about some of the literature on it. Everybody talks about it. It's fascinating. Like emotions, they come in positive or negative emotions. And obviously, we've spoken a bit about this before. We prefer pleasant and unpleasant in terms of descriptors. And anger, for most people, is an unpleasant emotion. It's not. It physically isn't a pleasant thing to feel. Like some of the body sensations, you feel tightness in your muscles, in your chest, maybe churning in your stomach. You might even, if you're so angry, you might visibly shake, and your mind might get tense and dizzy. And so it's like there's something going on in your body and in your mind that is like, I'm not relaxing, I'm not nice. There's something it needs to change.
Yeah, one of the things I read was actually because we often talk about anger negatively, many people that might be more prone to anger never learn how to channel it or harness that in a helpful way because of that. The flip side is something else I read that pushes back a little bit on what you said about anger is that the only research that has said anger is positive, shall we say, or has benefits was stuff done by self-report. And I think you said nobody enjoys being angry. I'm not sure that's true. I think some people do enjoy being angry.
Yeah.
I think though they might self-report the benefit. And so this was some interesting research that suggested so this idea that actually the best thing to do with your anger is just to let it rip, to get it out. You shouldn't let it stay inside you. And they said what the has been shown to happen is when you let it rip, it escalates the anger in yourself and the people around you. So there's something to be said for learning how to maybe control it or harness it in a useful way. But also, I don't think most of us know how to do anger well. And maybe that's a bit of it. But some people actually do think enjoy anger.
I think so, actually. And I suppose what I was getting at is typically the body sensations, and when you read the lists, but also if you think to your own experience, I think most people feel that unpleasantness, and yeah, it's not a calming, relaxing thing, which is what so much of what we've talked about before we desire. We move away from the hard things to the uncomfortable things. But of course, you don't have to read much into the news or the political discussion or the latest sports result to go, oh yeah, like people engage in this rage, and there's, or watch films about the hero saving the day, and it's like that wasn't just about overcoming a hard thing. That was glorifying anger and rage for how many revenge stories are there? Why do we keep telling these revenge stories? Why do this myth of redemptive violence, I think, is something that is massively entrenched in our society.
Do you remember that film? Probably 10 years ago now, the Machine Gun Preacher.
I do, yes. I can't remember all of it, but it was a interesting.
And that was, yeah, I mean, it's loose in my memory, but this, from what I can remember, the sort of paradigm being there was this, American Christian that goes out to somewhere else in the world, and really he's retribution. He's protecting people with his gun, and so he's this like machine gun preacher, and it's like, oh, we kind of like that, might and right, and sort of idea, and that sort of is some of the tension that you're talking about there. Is like, hey, we want people to be right, and we don't necessarily want to do that, but actually there's a bit of us that quite likes retributive justice, of being angry and getting our own back.
An article that I was reading, it's really fascinating. It was like 16 positive things about anger, And I was reading through it, and I was like, quite a lot of these are just split out from the same thing, but a few were really interesting. That they're all linked together, and it kind of came to the same fore of ultimately, in any kind of confrontation, escalating the anger can make you seem more you're important, that your points are more valuable, that you are more noteworthy, and ultimately another thing that we're saying was anger can give you a sense of control. And I think, oh, that's really interesting. And they were saying it can be used, it can be a helpful negotiating thing. And I think a level of aggression to get you to an alertness, sure. But of course, I think that narrative, and it's instinctual, isn't it? But that plays out in so many confrontations, is I want to get my point across. So I'm going to shout louder, and I'm going to make my body language more aggressive and more violent. And you go, well, in the moment, you might scare your opponent or the person opposite you into a submission to end the conflict. But I think long run, it's a very damaging course of action to take, even if you're not physically violent, swiping out. You are basically going, I win because might makes right. And I think it's a shortcut to persuasiveness. And I think ultimately you end up cheating yourself and the others of really getting to the bottom of the conflict.
Yeah. Well, and anger, one of the words that came up in some of the reading I was doing about it was this idea of power or being powerful. Like anger can feel powerful, as you said. It can lead to intimidation, and so you're now in control of the situation. You're the most powerful person there because and it's a physiological response. Your body goes kind of flush blood to your arms, to your legs,
Yeah.
so that you are ready to fight.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I read, is that ultimately one of the perceived triggers for anger is this idea of a combination of threat and vulnerability. That when we're feeling vulnerable and there is a threat, we get angry, and it's just people talk about evolutionarily, it's a survival thing. You have to have some anger to survive, because if you don't respond in this aggressive, angry way to threats or when there's vulnerability, you're not going to survive, which is interesting. Most of the threats in our world now are not, well, that's maybe not true, but most well, for me anyway, let me just say that, for me, probably most of the threats I experience are not putting
Life or death
threatening my life, but so much as threatening my ego. um,
or
and
indirectly threatening your life. For example, I might lose my job, therefore I might not get money to, pay rent, get food, those sort of things. So there is an indirectness, but our brains jump there pretty quickly.
And I was talking to somebody relatively recently. There's been some local elections, and we just chatted, and they were saying, "Oh, this party got in here," and then they just immediately got really angry. And I was like, "Whoa, like what's going on here? Like you're really angry about this." And I wonder if that's like the threat to the way of life. This party says the way of life should look like this. This party says your way of life should look like this. And they're making promises. It's not very difficult to bring them together. So when this party gets in, I'm so angry because that puts the way I want to live at threat. And so
Yeah.
I wonder if that's sort of underpinning some of the political anger and angst we have. It's like, well, that's not right.
Yeah, hugely, absolutely. Uh, We're we're going quite far and wide. But one of my personal experiences of anger, well, a few, anger and frustration have been common companions through my life. I wonder where I got it from, but you know, we talked about this before. Sports can be, people talk about like sport can build character, but you say ultimately the first thing sport does, unless you're intentional with it, it doesn't build character, but it reveals character because it puts you under that threat position. You're in a sense, by warming up and playing sport, your body is already getting into that same physiological state where blood is being pumped to the arms and the legs and ready for action, and you're starting to pump adrenaline around. So in a sense, just by warming up, you're physiologically getting yourself into a more aggressive state. The physiology is the same. But I can remember so many times, for example, when we first joined the Logos Hope back in 2017, and we joined the football team. There was someone that would arrange, matches with local teams. And I remember one of our first games, we were in the Caribbean, and somehow word had got out that basically their local team was playing an international football team, right? Well, the reality, of course, was it was a bunch of guys who had never played with each other from different countries. It's not an international football team.
Definitely not international level fitness.
Or skill, or coaching, or teamwork, or any of that. Nothing.
No, there's nothing international.
Basically, some guys that enjoyed kicking the football around, never played with it. So all the locals came round. It was quite well attended. Then there was a proper they got their referee in, and this guy was
hometown referee.
Hometown referee. And I know it's easy to blame the ref, but I had previously to that, I don't think I'd ever experienced a more biased refereeing performance. And I was so angry, and I was getting more and more wound up, giving them penalty for nothing, not giving us those sort of things. Eventually, we were losing somewhat, maybe two goals down or something. I remember just we had a free kick, it went in, and I headed it over the goalkeeper. It came off the bar, and then I managed to get it in off the rebound, and I just let out this kind of huge roar. It was not a celebratory roar. It was a vindictive roar of just come on. And that was just this. I felt, because I was we're not just playing against these guys. We're playing against the referee and the crowd, and it just felt so unfair. And that has riled me up so many times in my life. That feeling of injustice.
Which is brilliant. There's a book I've got and I've read a couple of times called The Resilience Factor. And it's 7 keys to finding your inner strength, or basically to being resilient. And the first one is called, or the first key is learn your ABCs. And A stands for adversity, or effectively, what pushes your buttons? Which seems like a good question. B is this idea of belief. What do you believe about that? And then C is the consequence of that belief. And they talked about that BC connection being really important. What you believe, and then the consequence of that belief. And one of the things they said is violation of rights leads to anger.
Yes.
That's the belief. I believe my rights have been violated, anger. So in this situation we're playing, the referee is not being he's being partial. He's not being impartial. He's not refereeing this game. That's unfair. That's a violation of the rights of me as a footballer, of me as a player, of our game. That's not fair that you're doing this for one team. For you, it's a violation of the rights as you perceive them. So that has led to your anger and that outburst of anger. And I just think that's a really interesting thing, that if we look at it in that way, when have my rights been violated, I lead to anger. That's quite, I thought, a helpful way of looking at it. And many people have accused people of being quite entitled, and so assuming that was true, maybe not just young people, but I think probably quite a lot of people become increasingly entitled about what we want. And in that state, there's more that we can be violated for.
Yes. Yes.
So then we're closer to anger every time. Hey, this is my right. I'm entitled to this. But if that gets taken away or touched, now I'm angry. I'm angrier. The more you feel you have a right to, the more likely that someone might accidentally cross into that.
Hugely. That's a very insightful point. I had not thought about that. And I think, in a sense, that you return to, well, I'm now thinking return to some of the sayings Jesus talked about when he was walking around. And people like to quote the story of when he said he got angry and he made a whip and was chasing everyone out of the temple. I'll come to that in a minute, but he talked about how if you want to save your life, you've got to basically lay it down and lose it, and pick up a cross, effectively pick up a torture instrument where you're going, I'm going to die. And it's a lot of that move is the complete opposite, isn't it? It's instead of going, I'm going to pick up my rights and hold on to them and make sure that nobody can take them from me. It's going, I'm going to let them go and forgo the rights, because actually from one perspective you could say ultimately the fact that we're here at all is just this amazing miracle. Why does anything exist? And all of life is a gift. There's no right. And so, as a Christian, you would say the very founder of the faith goes, the way you find life is by giving it up willingly. And I think that's really interesting, because that can be a helpful antidote. But I think that that's where the chasing people out of the temple was such a helpful story as well. I mean, there's the context around that specific, but part of it was he was chasing people out of an area in that temple which was open to outsiders from the Jewish religion, that Gentile court, and they were blocking them from basically being able to engage with relationship to God because they were using that space for them. And so his anger wasn't about his own rights. It wasn't about his own privileges. It was about, you're blocking other people from getting what they need. And I think, again, that's just a helpful corrective of, is my anger purely just self-righteous and self-protecting, or is it on the behalf of the one that doesn't have that power, doesn't have that voice? And of course, I think lots of people would say, yes, my anger is for the sake of the poor and the downtrodden and everything, and then go and destroy some property. Well, okay, maybe you found an outlet that appeases your rage, and then you've justified it. We're very good at rationalizing our behavior, but actually, has that helped their case? Has that helped? Has that helped move the needle? And we were discussing a little bit earlier, and I think we will come to this maybe in the future episode. But I was watching a documentary the other day, and I was listening to some podcasts by some other documentary makers highlighting some of the damages done in the porn industry and to do with sex trafficking and everything. And the guy that made this documentary said so many people since that's come out basically say, how could you stay so calm in those interviews? How could you stay calm and not basically just want to beat them up? And he's like, well, ultimately, actually, I had to remove myself from that situation. He's like, I'm martial arts trained. I could have taken that guy down. I could have beaten him into a pummel, but that would have defeated the point, because I needed the point was to actually get this stuff out there. And so in restraining his anger in the moment, it gives more credence because it allows the thing. But if he starts beating someone up, what's going to happen? Well, firstly, he's probably going to get arrested. Nobody would then be able to see the documentary. Nobody would ever accept an interview again. And the actual work that gets done in the movement is harmed. It's like, oh, that's really interesting. Restraint helps to, because that anger is there, but he goes, I'm going to channel that anger into being really professional in this moment, separating myself. And then we're just going to keep going. We're not going to give up. We're not going to let up.
Yeah, and I think that word you used earlier was quite interesting. There's a self-righteousness to anger a lot of times, which is where, that study I referred to earlier about generally the positive effects of anger are self-report. And that's probably to do with that self-righteousness. Well, I was right anyway,
Yes.
and so and when there's an other righteousness, it's on behalf of somebody else. That in some ways can be as alluring. Like, I think anger is quite an alluring one. And I think anger on behalf of somebody else can be quite alluring as well. And to harness that in a helpful way is quite interesting as an idea. And I saw somewhere basically said there are three main ways to deal with anger. There's the expression of it, there's suppression of it, and then there's calming tools. And then there's a lot of things that filter in under that. The idea of, can you be a bit funny at the appropriate time, which diffuses that? Can you breathe in a certain way? That's calming. Can you go for a walk? But I think the helpful thing is actually to examine the belief. What am I believing here? What's been violated? What's going on? What do I, and I really think, what is the belief here is quite an important one. There was an article I read on Psychology Today, and they talked about how there are different motivations for emotions. So they said guilt, the positive thing of guilt is that it motivates you to behavior more consistent with your deeper values. So when you feel guilt, actually it highlights, I'm not living with my deeper values. Oh, I should move to that. And
Yeah.
they said, shame in a similar way, it should lead to new attempts towards success. Oh, well, that didn't work. Let's try something else so I can achieve more success. And they said fear, it should create caution in you so that, you are more safety seeking. And in sadness, they talked about how that should motivate you for more value creation. When you're sad, you should hold the things you appreciate or the people you appreciate closer to you. Now, the
Mm.
interesting thing, the reason this relates to anger is all of these feel vulnerable. And basically his suggestion was many times anger covers those up.
Yeah.
We don't get the self-correction that would come from feeling that emotion. So
Yeah.
if guilt should motivate us to live more consistently with our deeper values, but instead we just get angry because we feel vulnerable. We don't
Yeah.
have the self-correction to our deeper values. We just have anger and we feel great about it, and then we're done, and nothing actually corrects us to these things. I thought, well, that's quite a deep, insightful, profound thing. And it's not always true, but actually, I just thought that was an interesting way to look at it, that actually we can use anger to subvert this vulnerability of some of these other emotions.
Hugely. I mean, I'm glad you said that, and I think that's expressed in a very helpful way. That was definitely something I wanted to pick up on, and I've experienced it myself. As I was saying earlier, frustration and anger have been emotions that I am well acquainted with in much of life, and part of it is to do with maybe some perfectionistic tendencies and wanting to do things well, and when things don't work out as I hoped they would or expected they would, you can get frustrated. Well, I can get frustrated with my job. One of the key frustrations that bugs everyone in our department is like this: when the software doesn't work as it should do.
Mm.
And it would be really interesting to dig a little bit under the belly of like, what's the beliefs going on there. I think part of it is, hey, we've paid good money for this software to work as it should. Why is it not? But I think part of it sometimes, and I've noticed this as well, when I'm working on an issue, or when I was a technician working on equipment, the hardest part of the job for me was when I was trying to fix a machine and I couldn't identify what the problem was. Right. Once I'd identified the problem and it was like, okay, well, now we know what need to do. It was a case of it's when, not if. But until you've identified the problem, it was always like, I don't know what's wrong with this. And that unknowing was the thing that was the most challenging. And so anger and frustration set in. And I think probably it was protecting over that vulnerability of, I'm ignorant. I'm incompetent because I don't know what's going wrong here. And so anger and frustration would cover over that. And sometimes it'd be really helpful because it's just like that burst of energy to go, I'm going to press through. I'm not going to give up. And that's some of the perseverance that's come from that. And I think you've seen that in my life. But sometimes it would then just lead to, you get wound up and you persevere and you persevere and you persevere. And then you just keep banging your head against the wall. And there's no outlet to that anger in a healthy way. And so then it becomes unhealthy. And there's something about that word frustration, like the desire, the goal has literally been prevented from happening. And unless then there is what's a healthy outlet or what's a calming measure, it can then become disruptive, either inward focused, reinforcing those beliefs. I'm incompetent, I'm no good, I can't do this, or outward, striking things or saying words of aggression. Or then if there's tension in a relationship and that's causing anger, those passive aggressive behaviors, which harmonizes people that aren't openly aggressive would say, oh, I wouldn't do that. But everybody knows those passive aggressive things where we go, I'm trying to take revenge on you in a way that but I'm not going to make it,
Explicit.
explicit.
Well, and there was something else I read that they were looking in, are some people more hot-headed, effectively, like more prone to anger? And if they are, what is it? And some stuff that says, maybe some kids are born a certain way, they respond to touch in a certain way. But one of the things they basically identified, whether this was a cause or not, was they have a low tolerance for frustration. And that's a word you used as well. And it's this idea of like, oh, we have a low tolerance for frustration, to being frustrated in what we're moving towards. And again, that's a belief, isn't it? That's kind of a violation, and that's where another word you used, I think, is probably of primary importance here. Should. It it's not meant to be like this. It shouldn't be like this. I should be able to. It shouldn't, this software should work smoothly.
Yeah.
I'm being paid not to error correct their software. I'm being paid to use it in a way that I can do it for the client. It shouldn't be like this. And when we notice those shoulds and shouldn'ts, I think that's really important. I mean, really recently, I noticed myself doing this, and that's what made me angry. It's like, well, my job shouldn't be to placate somebody who is twice my age. Like, that's not my job to try and like appease them because they can't manage themselves, and that makes me angry because it's like, well, they're twice my age, they should be twice my maturity, and they should be able to deal with that without like everybody else being around trying to placate them just in case. And I mean, it's quite difficult to tell stories around this without naming other people. But and so we end up going back to football, which can be vague enough. But we
Yeah.
definitely played football with a couple of people where you think, oh yeah, they had a really low tolerance for frustration.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of people we played with that I'll maybe put off against each other. There's one person that brilliant player, but if something didn't go the team's way in the first 10 or 15 minutes, they would get sent off. It was like a guarantee because the team, whether it's his teammates, whether it's the opposition, whether it's the referee, if there's any sort of like frustration in the game, he was getting sent off. Then you have someone at the other end who you rarely see get angry because they're like, stuff is just going to go wrong on the team, like on the game. There are people on the other team that are literally trying to stop you from doing what you're doing, right? That is their job, is to frustrate you. So get over it, like just deal with that. But you would say there was someone that was much more in control of their emotions and their frustration and their anger. And it's not that they don't, but actually they harness that in an assertive way rather than an aggressive or a lashed out way. And I think that's sort of the difference, isn't it? Can you harness it? I think, yeah, there were some calming things, but again, I mean, maybe this is the bit of me that's got a master's in sports psychology, but if you can get into that belief, where have I been violated? What's going on underneath? Once you identify that, you can test if it's true. You can decide, what's the consequence of this? Like, where do I want to do with this? Do I want to act out of anger or not? And I think those things can be quite helpful once you identify where you feel like you've been violated.
I think that's helpful. And I suppose coming to a close soon, but going back to those ABCs, adversity, belief, consequences. A slight twist on the adversity, like that football analogy has really helped as well, because and I think the frustration piece, because that's certainly a common experience for me, and I'm sure many people. We get angry when we feel frustrated or opposed in some way, and I think it's, again, the beliefs thing. What do I believe about the world? These reveal what I believe about the world, and from a faith-based perspective, from a Christian perspective, and also just that there's not just a materialistic world, there's more going on. I think it's important to remember, Jesus said their enemy is real, and the enemy has come to steal, to kill, and destroy. Or to be a little bit more nerdy out, the word that we often think of as a name, Satan, in English, that's become a name for the devil. Well, actually, it was just a title. It was just a word that was a title that just meant adversary. Interestingly enough, it meant adversary. And when Jesus then is leaving after his resurrection, he goes, back off to heaven, wherever that is, and he sends. What does he say? He says, "I'm sending you a helper," or another word for that is advocate. And I think that's something that's helpful as well, because in all these things, I mean, when I was working on a piece of equipment that wouldn't work, for example, the air conditioning units down in the engine room, the chillers, the huge expensive piece of equipment that was throwing up errors all the time. If I was on my own and trying to solve that, it was very difficult. And I was more and more discouraged, more and more ready to give up. But there was this moment when another engineer, guy called Ken, much older in his career, much more experienced, and he just came alongside and was like, "Hey, I'm going to help you with this." And all of a sudden I had an advocate, I had a helper, and we attacked that problem together. and it changed the equation. And so I think part of it as well is to remember, like, in football terms, there is literally opposition that you can see in front of you. There might, in your life circumstances, be other opposition that you can't necessarily see, isn't necessarily so obvious, but just being aware of that and going, this isn't a zero-sum game. There are adversaries here, or maybe, you know, so what's the adversity, but also maybe think, who's the adversary, and then who can maybe be an advocate in this situation.
Definitely. Anger's an interesting one. I'm sure we all have stories of when we've acted out of anger. That leaves us feeling shame, and so we get angry about that, you know, to cover up our shame. But I think it was good to go into some of the deeper parts of it, rather than just talk about, hey, what does anger look like? You know, does it just look like a hole in the wall, or are there other things going on? And I think that idea of life shouldn't be this way is a big source of our anger. And so it's, yeah, figuring out what we believe about the world and how that looks can really help us unlock those things.
Yeah.
So let us know what you are finding helpful about these conversations at the moment. We've enjoyed this conversation about anger. We talked about grief the other week, and we found that these valuable, driving us to read stuff and reread stuff we've come across. And we're by no means experts on this. We are explorers, so we're always interested to hear what you think about these things and what you're finding helpful.
Absolutely.
That's all for this week at the Make It Count podcast.